The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
I don't even know where to start with this show today because I have so many questions to ask and so much has changed in such a short period of time. But I want to start with where you start when anybody comes to you with a podcast, and that is the why.
Yeah.
One of the things you always ask is, what is your why for doing this podcast? So what sort of answer are you looking for when you ask that question?
Well, I want to be seen as an expert. I want to reach a global audience because I can't get any media press. I want to grow my network. I want to make some money. Those are the typical ones. And then there's the other one. I want to have fun with my friends that people overlook that. I'm like, sometimes that is the payment. I had two guys last night on the podcast review show, and I'm pretty sure the reason they do this is they've known each other for 50 years and they're both improv guys and they love to just get together and riff off each other. And now they're just letting the world listen to it. So yeah, those are the biggies. It's some combination of all of those usually. But if you don't know what it is, then if I want to be seen as an expert, then maybe I'll do a 20-minute episode once a week and kind of look at what I know. Look at me. You should hire me. But if my goal is to keep my brand in front of you, then I might do a daily show that's 5 minutes that at the end says, and there was a show and I don't remember the name of the show. I just remember it was brought to you by the Association of Christian Athletes. And that was the way they ended every single episode. The show's been brought to you by the Association of Christian Athletes. And so 5 days a week, that got beat into my brain. I can't remember the name of the show. That and the host's name was Jimmy Page. And every time they said that, I'd think of Led Zeppelin, so that was kind of fun.
You get cashmere stuck in
That's
your
it.
head. And usually podcasters have an expectation that after a certain amount of time, it could be 7 episodes. I find often it's 17 episodes or 6 months. I want to monetize.
Right.
And then it gets a little bit complicated because maybe not everybody should, can, will. And the big question they ask you is, how do I monetize my show?
Yeah, because usually at that point, 17 episodes, you may not have a huge audience yet. And depending on what your content is, you can't monetize dust. And so Kevin Schmidlin over at Grow the Show had a great point. He goes, when you want to monetize, you're asking your audience to take their credit card out for something. And he goes, that either means they're buying a product or service from you, which is what I always recommend. Or if you have sponsors, they have to buy something from the sponsor, because if not, that sponsor's not coming back. But you have to figure they're going to be buying funding or whatever it is. And the bad news of that, at least for when I was looking into crowdfunding, it's if you're lucky, if you're really good, you'll get 3%. And so when you have, let's just for easy math, say 100 listeners, okay, 3 of them gave you $7 a month. Okay, you paid for your hosting, but your goal was to quit your day job after 17 episodes. And like, not a bad dream, just way, way, way too early. And then you get really bad expectations. Like I did a YouTube video on how to do a podcast like Joe Rogan, and I got a lot of thumbs down because I said, okay, number one, start your career about 17 years ago, and then I think it took him like 7 years to make a comedy album. And then he was on TV and then he did Fear Factor. And I'm like, so that's all you have to do is takes to Mr. Beast. I just found out the guy on YouTube is like the number one YouTuber. Like for his first 7 years, he couldn't figure out really what he wanted to talk about. So when you're coming in at 17 episodes, I don't want to discourage anybody, but I'm just like, it's just not the way it typically works.
So I'm thinking back to that longevity, whether it was Joe Rogan or Mr. Beast, and what really used to go on in rock and roll and music is it used to take, it took Metallica 7 albums before they took off. It took REM 7 albums before they got signed to Warner and really began to take off.
Yeah.
And that model still holds true today. Last time you were on the show, we talked a little bit about 3 years to build an audience.
Yeah.
And does that still hold
Still
true?
seems to be every time I have a clip that I have, it's a folder of clips of people saying, yeah, things didn't really take off till about, and it's usually 3 years. Occasionally I'll get somebody that said 2, but it's like, when did it really start? Somebody will ask a panel or whatever, when did you really start making money? And if I was a betting man, I'd be like, here, put 100 on 3 years. It just seems to be the most common answer because it just takes a while. The first year you're finding yourself, the second year you found yourself, and now you've got your audience starting to promote your show. And by the third year, you've got enough people telling their friends about it that it's self-propelling at that point.
One of the things I find about podcasts, you could be monetizing your podcast right now and not even know it because it's a form of marketing. Here I am. Here's what we're doing. Here's the value in the show. And people know about you. That's a form of marketing.
Yeah. I mean, I work at Libsyn because I have a podcast. I got hired at Chancellor University because I knew about podcasting. I was hired for the New Media Expo, which at the time, this was pre-podcast movement, was a huge conference. And the guy called up, I didn't work at any of these companies yet, but he called Spreaker, Blueberry, and Libsyn and said, who should we hire to run the podcasting track? And they all said, Dave Jackson. So welcome to Humble Brag Theater. But it's true. And so he finally called me. He goes, I'm tired of talking to people who say I should just call you. So I'm just going to call you. And that's because your podcast can be like this cool little digital resume. You get to prove I know what I'm talking about. You can somewhat prove that you have an engaged audience on different metrics. And so when you go, oh, by the way, I can do this. When people on occasion will contact me, they're like, hey, can we get together and just pick your brain? I want to make sure we're a good fit. And I go, look, I have 928 episodes of the School of Podcasting. If you can't figure out we're a good fit, we're not a good fit. I'm like, just so it's a great way to, I always joke, it's a great way to meet thousands of people without meeting thousands of people.
I find it interesting. A lot of people were like a guest for another podcast sent me a note saying, can you give me some background on what we're going to be talking about? I'm like, well, there's 300 episodes inside this podcast already. You might want to listen to a few of those episodes. You'll pretty much understand the line of questioning that we're going to have for you today.
Just an idea. Yeah. I love when I get the feng shui expert who wants to be on the School of Podcasting. And I'm like, unless somehow moving the furniture is going to help me grow my audience, I'm not really sure you're a good fit. So yeah, a little research always helps, both on the guest side and both on the host if you don't know who the guest is. So
I'm glad you mentioned feng shui, because a nice niche idea, like let's say basket weaving. If you're going to start a podcast about basket weaving, and we're probably only going to get about 100, maybe 200 downloads per episode, what should I be looking at as a way to monetize?
Well, with that feng shui, because I know what it is, but I don't know that much about it. But it's either maybe you're a consultant on how to set up your living room. That would be the easiest way. And then maybe there's your favorite ergonomic furniture that might want to sponsor the show. There's got to be other ways to do that. And then so there's always bonus content. If you have people who really love your show, there's affiliate. So if there's some sort of feng shui product that ties in, there's affiliate marketing. There's all sorts of different ways. The fun news is all of those work a little bit. So it's always like, well, which one should I use? I'm like, no, it's not which one. Use them all. I have some months that, remember, somebody bought a big screen TV at Amazon, and I think you make a whopping 4%. But all of a sudden I'm like, wait, what did somebody buy? Because all of a sudden this check came through and I was like, all right, well, thanks, whoever that was. So it comes and goes. Sometimes my consulting's, I'm super busy, and other days it kind of dims down, and then affiliate stuff will come up, or all of a sudden a bunch of new patrons will show up. So it's kind of like a stock portfolio. By having multiple streams of income, if one goes down, maybe the other one will go up.
So I felt that podcasters did a pretty good job right up until about 2018, 2019, really conveying and expressing what an RSS feed is, and this is what podcasting is. And then along comes YouTube to really muddy the waters and create this confusion. And, at Podcast Movement in 2023, one of the big sessions was the new rules of podcasting, which sort of shows how video is integrating with podcasting. They're calling it podcast, but it's not audio in an RSS feed. So tell me about the confusion that's involved with that and really what it's led to.
Yeah, as a guy with a teaching background, my job is to make things clear to understand. And a big giant gorilla walked in and just muddied the water. And people are like, well, you're anti-YouTube. And I'm like, no, I'm anti making things hard to understand. A great example of this is country music used to be, wah, 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 the truck, and my mom's in jail, that whole 9 yards. And then they changed what country is now. Country now is AC/DC with a fiddle. And I listen to that, I'm like, that's not country. That's rock with somebody with a twang. And I'm like, but now country, in quotation marks, which is really rock, is now the top selling genre. Beyonce just released what? A country album. Why? Because that's where the money is. So YouTube and Facebook, Google and Facebook, had a really good handle on advertising. And along came this little thing called TikTok that took a big bite out of their advertising. And so I'm picturing these guys at YouTube going, hey, we got to do something to get people talking about YouTube. And somebody said, I don't know, Larry, what do you got? Larry's like, I don't know, podcasting seems hot. So they're like, great, YouTube is now podcasting. And that's really what they did. They just took out a magic wand and said, you're a podcast. And so what I hate about this is number one, I was helping two podcasters last night and they're like, well, we're thinking we really need to get into video because, and I'm like, hold on, I'm going to ask you a question. They're like, I said, why? I said, you guys are having fun. Your podcast is successful for you. Why do you have this need to do video? And they're like, I don't know. Just that was really their answer was, I don't know. Everybody just says I need to do video. And I go, well, I'm here to give you permission to not do video. I said, now, if you have, obviously it's the number 2 search engine. Everybody quotes that. And that's absolutely true. But if you have the time and the budget and you want to do video, by all means do video. What I don't understand is why that's not called being a YouTuber anymore. Now everybody's a podcast. And so when I hear people say, oh, I have a podcast, and I go to Apple and I can't find your show, I'm like, wow, who is advising these people? They're not in the number 1 podcast app. And I find out later, oh, it's a YouTube thing. So that's what just drives me nuts. It makes things very confusing. And the thing that I hate is I have people and they'll tell me their idea for a podcast. And I'm like, that sounds amazing. It's unique. It's going to be great. And they're like, yeah, I don't know. I just can't do video though. And I'm like, okay, well, don't do video. And they're like, yeah, but don't you have to do video? And I'm like, no, you don't have to do video. So people think I'm anti-video. And I'm like, I'm only anti-video when it stops somebody with a great message and a great passion, but they don't want to do video. That's what drives me nuts. And the fact that, when they come out now with reports, my favorite is when they'll say, people are finding video podcasts on YouTube. And I'm like, okay, video podcast in English is video. So you're basically telling me more people are finding videos on YouTube. And I'm like, is this really revealing? Is this like some major reveal? Like, oh my gosh. But because they're calling a podcast now, it's like, oh, people are finding video podcasts on YouTube. And I'm like, well, so I always say there's a Spotify video podcast. It only goes to Spotify. There's a YouTube video podcast that only goes to YouTube and YouTube Music. And then there's me, what I call an original video podcast, which goes to about 20 different apps. Yeah, like, so again, it just makes things confusing.
Yeah. So you just pointed out something that's obvious. I know it sits there, but I don't really care about. And that you could put your video into an RSS feed. You can put your video on Spotify and you can put your video on YouTube. But when people say I want to be on video, they're really only talking about YouTube. Right. I don't think I've ever watched a video on Spotify. If you told me to put this video up on Spotify, I think, oh, great, there's something else to do. And I'm not sure anybody's going to find it anyway, because it's not the world's number 2 search engine. And I don't think anybody would want to download this show. Nothing against what we're doing, but that's a heavy download to go into any device.
Right. That's why YouTube took off, because you can have a true video podcast, but video files are big. Most of the media hosts are based on how much we store for you each month. So your bill's going to, I don't know, double at least. And that was back when Apple used to have a tab in Apple Podcasts. It said audio and then another tab for video. And because YouTube was, YouTube, anything video just went to YouTube. I think right now, 50 episodes as a video, as a test on Spotify. Because if you listen to Spotify's press releases, everybody's watching video on Spotify. I'm like, well, not my stuff. I literally have less than 20 downloads and I probably have 15 episodes. And I'm going to say 13 of those are me. So at least for me, a podcast about podcasting, they're not watching video on Spotify. And I always say, if you saw somebody at the grocery store like, hey, did you see that video about that kid that did the thing? You're going to go home and go to YouTube. You're not going to Spotify to look for that. So I love Spotify for music. I'm a subscriber. Like, stay in your lane. YouTube, I love you for video. And for YouTubing, stay in your lane. Audible, I love you for audiobooks. Stay in your lane. Because the more you add all this stuff, it gets all clunky. Like, YouTube Music is not a great app now for podcasts. I do listen to audiobooks in Spotify now, but I do notice they don't have like a bookmark feature. So it's kind of clunky, because what they do is after you listen to a chapter, they hide it from you so you can't go back and listen to it again. And I was like, yeah, I didn't ask for that feature. I want a bookmark so I can go back to that part. So yeah, I kind of wish they would all just, like, instead of trying to be everything to everyone, just be the best at what you are.
You think YouTube made a mistake getting rid of Google Podcasts?
We're all like going, you got to be kidding. 3% of the market doesn't sound like much, but in podcasting, anybody trying to get into that market, because I used to say, you will pry Overcast from my cold dead hands. And the only reason I'm not using Overcast is because the guy, Marco, said, I'm never doing this podcasting 2.0 stuff. And I was like, okay. So I found an app that looked and smelled just like his. And I'm like, okay, this is my new app. And all YouTube had to do was make it visible. It was there. It was on your phone. There just wasn't an icon. And from what I understand, the Android operating system is not like Apple, where everybody is more or less on the same version. I guess on Android phones, it's a little different. But I was like, come on, you're Google. You got to be able to figure that out. Because I'm pretty sure the same way people are like, what's this purple thing on an iOS phone? They click it. Oh, it's podcast. And I have lots of people that loved it because it also had a really nice web-based version. And so for the person that's like, I don't like technology, here, copy paste this. There it is. It's on your website. Now you can listen to it. So I was deeply just like, oh, because the other thing is we've had Google Plus. They've had a bunch of things that they've killed. And I was like, they can't
Google
Google
Glasses.
Glasses. But I remember when they're like, we're going to put podcasts on the front page of Apple or of Google. And for a while they did. And then they didn't. And you're just kind of like, oh, so have fun arguing with Google. I don't know. I mean, I talked to some people from Google at these events, and I sometimes feel like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
I remember that. They didn't roll it out in Canada right away. They rolled it out in the US, and I went to, I think it was like youtube.com/podcast or
Right.
something. And then I saw the podcast go up there and I go, I don't know who any of these people are. Has there been another podcast dimension that was created in another faraway planet that we just are meeting now? I thought it was very bizarre.
And then you look at it and you go, oh, these are all really popular YouTubers. Oh, that's why I haven't heard of these. And so, yeah, Joe Rogan is not on that page. That's the one that really scratches my head, because I'm like, wait, how? And that just means that Joe hasn't gone in and waved the magic wand and said, okay, you are now a podcast, because you do have to check a little box in YouTube to make that happen. But yeah, I'm with you. And on one hand, YouTube has this great algorithm, and if you can figure out how to crack it, you're good to go. But yeah, when I went to that page, I was like, I've never heard of any of these.
I was really looking to see what would happen when Google Podcast goes away. I know it's only been 10 days in the US and it hasn't gone away in other parts of the planet. But the minute the announcement came down, I could see that consumption was dropping. But who's going to pick up the pieces to that? And it turns out just Apple and Spotify are going to pick up the pieces. Amazon would love to have 3% on their app.
What Amazon needs to quit doing is, when you go to Amazon the first time to consume podcasts, they beat you over the head with, please join Amazon Music. And I get that. It's marketing, but I'm like, that's my first impression. Not, wow, look how easy it is. You're asking for the sale and I haven't even made it into the door yet. So I wish they would quit doing that. And the other thing that this has to be two different teams. The fact that your link to your show in Google Podcast does not now redirect to YouTube Music. And I thought maybe at first, maybe you can't link to a show in YouTube Music, but you can. So that to me is just, again, missed opportunity. Sounds like maybe somebody rushed something. It's a head scratcher, because if I was doing that, I always say, if you quit one show, so let's say you've done the show for 10 years, you're tired of talking about the same thing, and you're going to start this new thing, you would definitely let your audience know, because a lot of times people, they come for the content, but they stay for the host. When I first started, I had a show for musicians and I had a show for podcasting. And I had people coming to the music show and I'm like, oh, I didn't know you're a musician. What do you play? And they're like, oh, I'm not a musician. I just think you're funny. And I was like, wait, what? So I can't believe they're not redirecting, because that would be an easy way to get a bunch of new users into YouTube Music. And then you can say, oh, by the way, buy our product.
I know you have the numbers and you work with some incredibly successful podcasters, and maybe even some who've gone from video to audio. So do you have any stories of people who were really wanted to reside in video, but then when you showed them the way in audio, that the numbers were just way bigger in audio?
Well, for a while, Bill Maher was on Libsyn. And when Bill was on, he does Club Random, and he was really into this video thing. He's got this cool little basement in a house next to his house. And Rob Walsh was working with him and said, hey, you're going to do audio too. And he's like, no, we're just going to do video. And he's like, you should probably do audio. So we talked him into audio. He then hired a team to promote just the video. And when it finally came out and, got off the ground, audio outperformed video about 10-1. So it's just one of those things where, again, when I hear these people go, I kind of feel like I have to be on video. And I'm like, well, you're getting that from presentations from YouTube. Well, of course, YouTube is going to say you should be doing a quote video podcast, right, in giant quotation marks on YouTube. because that's more stuff that they can run ads on. So you always want to consider your source on anything. I remember when, if you were around for the fat is bad phase in the 80s and 90s, yeah, that was based on a report that came out from the sugar people, because when you pull all the fat out of your food, it tastes like cardboard. So how do you fix that? You pump it full of sugar. So always consider your source when you hear any kind of report that comes out that says, wow, I feel like I should really do this now. Like, okay, hold on. Where did we get that report from?
The sugar lobby is quite strong in the
Yeah.
US. Any Canadian who goes down to a border town, go pull a cereal box and look at the sugar in an American cereal box versus a Canadian one. You'll see the sugar lobby in action.
Very much so, yes.
I want to talk a little bit about podcast websites. You're a big proponent of Podpage. I'm a fan as well, but this is something I see a lot of podcasters just skip over. People start talking about their budget, what they're going to do for a podcast, and I say, well, where's the website? And there's something, what is the importance of having a website still to this day for your podcast?
Yeah. Can I do a shameless plug?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just literally launched a podcast about this. It's at your podcast website because of this issue. I was sitting in a live or a stream or whatever you want to call it these days. I'm old. I want to call it a webinar. And all these questions were coming up because it was about SEO and getting the most out of your website. And I was like, wow, these people are missing like part one. And we all quote, YouTube's the #2 search engine. Yep. You know what the #1 is? Google. You know what it looks at? Websites. I'm like, why are we so just incredibly giddy about YouTube and we're skipping the #1? And so, and the other thing is, especially if you're trying to monetize, you have to have some place to go buy your stuff. And in the first episode, I talk about things like mp3.com. And I remember TV commercials saying, build your website on Facebook. No one would do that now because they own it, so things like that, you need a place that's your own. And what really just, I go, wait a minute, I'll go in and somebody's typed this huge amount of episode descriptions, their show notes, and then they'll direct people to the Libsyn website or the Buzzsprout website. I'm like, wait a minute, your book's on your website. Why aren't you pointing people at your book? And they're like, well, they either A, thought they had to use their media host website. I'm like, nope, just all you have to do, it's 2 copy and paste, one for the, the text and one for the player, and it's on your website. And then what people miss is, so now I've got words. I'm in the world of Google now. I've got words on my page. So I'm going to get found. Great. So I click the link from Google. I go over to your website. Oh, wow, there's a player here. Let's see what happens when I click this. Oh, wow, this is entertaining. So I sit there for 13 minutes and Google goes, well, that's really weird. Every time I send something over to that website, they sit there for like 10, 15 minutes. This must be really good content. So then if somebody likes it, they can share it with their friend, more SEO juice. So it is one of those things that I realized that it's overwhelming when you first start a podcast because you're like, look, I just want to talk into a microphone. And now I got to learn social media. I've got to learn how to edit my audio. I might be doing video stuff. And now I got to do a website. So I get it, but it's really one of those things, especially if you're trying to get engagement with your audience. I literally just had somebody say some very nice things about me on a TV show. And I went to the TV shows. It's a video podcast, went to their website, a gazillion links. Not one of them said contact. And I actually had to reach out to them on Twitter to say, hey, can I get a clip of that? It was really nice to hear. So you need a website for people to contact you. I've gotten a sponsorship before because I had a website and it was somewhat organized and looked okay. And they're like, oh, yeah, you look legit. Here, have some money. So there are all sorts of reasons to have a website. And by that, I don't mean Linktree. Linktree is just a bunch of links. There's no SEO in Linktree. And it's funny because, yeah, it's going to cost you $20 a month, maybe a little more. But it's always funny how your little one comes up and little Susie needs braces and somehow you find the money for that. Like, why not put down the Starbucks and get a website?
You're also probably going to use Google to find the orthodontist who has a website who can get little Susie the braces.
Exactly. When you say, and I always love when people go, find me wherever you find podcasts. That's the worst thing you can say because most people don't realize, I know it, I live it every day in support. You can go in some cases into Apple and Spotify and type in the exact name of the show and it won't show up. And I'm just like, so you've just sent your audience down a rabbit hole. Why not put links to Apple and Spotify and Amazon on your website? So now it's yourwebsite.com/follow. Now we're reinforcing that brand again. If people share that, we're getting some more SEO. It's just all these things. I'm like, yeah, it all starts with your website. And with things, I know you mentioned Podpage. I love it. And I love the fact that I can hit publish in my media host, go grab a sandwich and come back and my website's updated. So yeah, it's not something where you have to be a giant geek anymore either.
And I'm glad you started this podcast. I know you were soliciting questions at one point in Facebook. I might have thrown you a couple, but I've got you now, so I'll just ask them. So transcription. At one point, you've got to have transcription and embed it somewhere into the site. So if I take my transcription for, let's say, this show, and I copy and paste it, and then I paste it right into the blog page for the episode page for the show, Google's going to look at that as being a 25-minute read. And I'm wondering if I'm going to get marked below the line and Google's not going to send people here because it's such a long read. Is that possible?
Well, there are a couple things. I always say Google likes good words. And so I am guilty of this. You take a transcript and you just like, look, I got to pick up somebody at soccer. So you just copy and paste and you put a thing at the top. This is an unedited version of the transcript. Have fun. Well, when somebody then reads that transcript and it's like, what's the weather like today? All that chit chat's in there, things like that. So they do like good words. And I usually say we don't write like we talk and we don't talk like we write. And so usually my episode description is just a blog post. I do that before I actually record because it helps keep me focused on what the heck I'm supposed to be talking about. I don't read it because who wants to hear someone read their blog post to them on their podcast? That's boring. But it does let me figure out what the heck am I trying to say on this episode. So I flush that out and then I just copy and paste that. So yeah, I put the transcript, but I am guilty of that. Just going, hey, kind of like if you wanted to get the gist of what's in this episode, I write really extensive descriptions from my episodes, but I usually say this is unedited and I will try to cut out the cat talk or French toast recipes or whatever we're talking about before we actually hit record for that. But I could see the too long don't read kind of thing, but I don't know. No, I've read where Google likes a couple thousand words for a really like cornerstone kind of episode. So that might actually be a good thing.
So I've taken down my Google badge. I actually did that about 6 months ago and I heard they weren't going to invest in it. So I'm not going to invest in them and I got rid of them. I'm not very keen on putting up any YouTube badge. I haven't really tried the app. I don't want to send people to a YouTube page to necessarily watch us. I hope they discover us there because I'm really interested in the download and having clients and dynamic audio insertion get into people's ears. So what badges should I be putting on my website?
Yeah, always Apple and Spotify. By doing that, you'll get 80% of the market. The one that I'm sniffing that I still like, well, there's two. One is Podurama, and it works on Android, it works on iOS. They have a beautiful web interface. There's one feature missing, and that is they don't do anything in the podcasting 2.0 space. And I was like, oh, come on. So then I found Podcast Guru, and it does pretty much everything you want it to do. I'm a big fan of what I call a smart playlist, where I can go and make a playlist called Health. And then I have a couple shows I listen to that are about weight loss and fitness. And I can say when they have a new episode out, put them in the health playlist. And when I'm in the mood to listen to health stuff, I go to my health playlist. And what do you know? There's 6 episodes in there. They don't do that. There's the other side of that is what's called a queue. And this is where you want your app to deliver a wheelbarrow full of episodes. And you go, yep, this one, that one, and that one. And you throw it into the queue. And your queue is like just a giant playlist. And so I talked to the guys at Podcast Guru and said, hey, any chance you guys are coming out with a smart playlist? And thankfully they said yes. So I don't have an ETA, but that is one I like because they do also have an Android and iOS, and they have a web-based version, which is kind of handy. I listen to podcasts when I can at work, and I love to have it on a computer screen. And then when it's time to go to lunch, I'll grab my phone and you can just kind of pick up right where you left off. So those are the two right now that I like. I know there's Pocket Casts has just added chapters. So I was excited about that because originally they came on and said, we're going to do the podcasting 2.0 stuff. And like a year and a half later, they'd done 0. So it sounds like they're slowly stepping up to the game. And there's Podcast Addict has been around forever, but they, again, just going to their website, you're going to get hit with about 4 ads, like annoying ads. And like, I'm just trying to get to the search box. So they're a little aggressive and I understand people have to eat, but as a first impression, I was like, ugh. So, but that's another one there. But I think right now, if I had to pick one, I'd say Podcast Guru, even though they don't have the feature that I really like, but it's on the way.
So thinking back to about 2018 and there was a lot of discussion in podcasting about becoming IAB certified. How are we going to count? Let's learn to count properly. SoundCloud doesn't know how to count. They don't even know how to get the categories into Apple. If SoundCloud's easy to pick on because they haven't changed anything in so long and do not use SoundCloud. But someone like me, I've got a few podcasts that are sitting on Megaphone because I'm a big fan of being IAB certified. And you wake up one morning, and that morning was Monday, and it is no longer IAB certified. So now what?
Yeah, that's a head scratcher because I remember pre-certification, and one was Podcast One. Nobody says this out loud, but I will. But they were little, not in a mean-spirited or fraudulent kind of way, but everybody knew their numbers were a little higher than everybody else's. And so if I was a buyer, I'd be like, oh, okay, we pay everybody else X amount of money. If they're hosted on Podcast One, we're going to pay them a little less because we're not really getting in front of that many people. So what happens is you have stuff like that. And that was the whole thing that the IAB was supposed to solve. And so why Spotify? I did hear James Cridland today say it's based on how much money you make, is your bill is based on that. I did see where they had 3.8 billion in revenue with a 26% margin. So it doesn't sound like they're cash poor, but according to James, it would have cost Spotify $500,000. And I'm like, to me, that sounds like a lot of money. Maybe if you're making billions, maybe it's not. I'm not going to be surprised because Spotify, as much as they love to say, oh, we're into open stuff, and then release other things like, oh, you can do a video podcast on Spotify, asterisks. If you take our feed, though, only the audio goes into the quote video feed. So there's always a little like asterisk. And so I would not be surprised to hear that Spotify comes out with some sort of standard or something, and they're going to try to get everybody to use their standard because they seem to be a little headstrong about world revolves around Spotify. And I would not be surprised by that. But yeah, I don't get it. I don't get the move. As far as I know, they haven't really said why. They just said we're not. And I'm like, okay. So it's odd. And I know Podbean was another one that didn't recertify. Libsyn just did. Captivate did. A bunch of us did. It is a pain in the butt and it's not cheap. But we wanted to all be able to say a download is this and all be able to do that. And the whole point of that was to make it better for the advertising industry because they were a little nervous coming in. So we all became IAB certified. And when you have a big player like Spotify pull out, you're kind of like, oh, here again, you're not playing nice with others. And I'm sure they're not doing it. Who knows? But I don't think they said, hey, let's mess up the whole podcasting space. Let's not be IAB certified. I wish they would have come out with, here's the plan, but it is a head scratcher.
Yeah, I've been a part of some radio groups in the past who don't like the way their ratings were compiled. So they would leave Arbitron and go to something else, or they would try to save the $50,000 and hey, we're not going to do ratings. We're just going to sell on the value that we have. I was thinking in my head, okay, how much is Spotify saving with this? I think the 500,000 number that James says is probably close because they probably have about 6, 7 properties between Anchor, Chartable, Megaphone, and some other thing that they would have to, and each one of those things can be anywhere $50,000 each, perhaps.
Yeah.
Depending on the amount of data that you have to feed them. So I think the number's right. But yeah, I'm worried that we're going to lose trust in podcasting when it comes to that. But there'll be more on that down the road, I'm sure. But let me ask you about podcasting 2.0, because you mentioned it twice so far. It's a complicated thing that not everybody understands. But as we turn the page and look at some things that we want to put into RSS feeds to make things a little bit easier, what parts of podcasting 2.0 are you looking for? What sort of features?
Man, I love chapters. I hated chapters in the early days of podcasts because I remember being an Apple podcast and they called them enhanced podcasts. They didn't call them chapters. And I'd want to go to the next episode and it would go to the next section of the current episode I was in. But now doing shows where I have multiple topics, I love chapters. I love the fact that you can have a link that you can click on. So if you're talking, I would think sponsors would love chapters because you can put a trackable link right there. So I love those. I love the pod roll feature where when I hear about this in a pod roll feature, if you were around for MySpace and you had your 8 favorite friends, well, now you can have more than 8 and then you can make like a chart based on this because it's like a recommended. Here's a recommended show. Now that could be somebody else or it could be another one of your shows. But I love the fact you can then make a chart based on what people are just organically recommending. I love that feature. The one that grabs everybody's attention is the whole streaming Bitcoin thing, because who doesn't want to make money? And that's actually, I'm excited because True Fans.fm, that Sam Sethi, just made it to where you can just take a good old fashioned credit card and put $10 worth of Bitcoin into a wallet, because that was a pretty big hurdle. And a lot of times your bank would like flag it as who knows what. And so I was really happy to see that. So I love that feature. And I'm the youngest of my family. So when I grew up, in 1970, when Jimi Hendrix died, I was the only kid in first grade who knew who Jimi Hendrix was. And I always kind of consider myself this little young baby hippie. And so when I hear about people getting canceled, or, I'm going to go after your advertisers, I love the fact that we could have a direct connection with our audience. And so when they say, that's it, we're going to get you canceled, I'm like, well, have fun with that, because I've got X amount of listeners and you're going to have to go to each and every one of them, and they get to pick how valuable the show is. I just watched a YouTube video. There's a really phenomenal blues guitarist named Joe Bonamassa, and Joe tours nonstop and has lots of money because his tickets are not cheap because he's Joe Bonamassa. But I was watching this video. He collects guitars, and if I remember, he paid $150,000 for a guitar. And I was like, what? Well, A, Joe has the money, and B, growing up, he had some guy on his wall in a poster, and that guitar is the guitar in the poster. So to Joe, that has a ton of emotional value to it. And he's got 150,000. And to him, it was like, oh, it's well worth it to have that guitar. And so when you let your audience pick, you might be thinking, I'll be lucky if I get $5. And then you're going to have somebody goes, here's 50, because you gave them value that they couldn't get anyplace else. So that's one of those things that I was like, oh, it could be huge. And I remember when I first started podcasting in 2005, uploaded a file and I saw it come back down on my computer. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. This could be really, really huge. And I kind of have that same feeling about podcasting 2.0. My worry is that, much like TikTok taking a bite out of the advertising space, if more people start to use this, I can see where eventually advertisers are going to start like ganging up on the little guy, and we'll see. But I love it. And they're branching into music and things like that now, but it's got a huge potential. I just want to see it get easier, and a couple more years will be there probably.
So if I wanted to start doing that, tell me about the app you use to send sats. And by the way, thank you. You have sent sats to me before when you've listened to an episode that you like. You've done it two ways. You've sent me some satoshis directly, and as well, you've streamed some progressively towards me as you listen to the show. So there's a few ways to send it to people, but I love the fact that you do send me a little something. So what app are you using to do that?
So behind the scenes, there's a service called Albi. You can get it at getalbi.com. And it's weird, as much as podcasting 2.0 tries to be decentralized, we're all using this one service, which is kind of like, But what I love is, if I wanted to right now, I could go to True Fans, because it's easy to fill your wallet there, fill up my Albi wallet, which is tied to the app I use to listen, which is called Cast-O-Matic. And I can go in and say, oh, this show, it actually shows you what you're paying per hour. So it's like, oh, well, I should give this guy at least $1 an hour. Holy cow. If we could get 10% of their audience to do this, or $2 an hour, or $5 an hour, again, depending on what you're doing, maybe you want to pay minimum wage, $15. It's there. And what I love is when somebody says something and I'm not driving, and I'm like, oh, that was amazing, I can go over, and there are these things called boosts. People are getting into all these numerologies, like 1701 is a Star Trek boost and 7777 is a Striper boost. So all fun ways to do this. And I was just researching how to tie in SMS, good old text messaging, into a podcast. And right now there's a service called Slick Text. It's about $30 a month. And I was like, well, wait a minute. We kind of already have messaging with our audience in podcasting 2.0. It's called a boostagram. And the beautiful thing is, people can pay you as little or as much as they want to send you a message. It's a message with a value amount to it. So I'm like, that's already here in podcasting 2.0. I'm over here trying to figure out how to work all this numbers and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, you know what? We already have this and it's free.
Yeah, I heard James Cridland referred to it as fairground tokens at one point. I know it sounds like minimal, but that's what they are, and they're effective. Did you send me 2112?
Yes.
You sent me a little rush.
I sent you a rush, yes. So
I'm a huge Rush fan.
Well, yeah. How can you not be?
Yeah, I've sent 5150 before. Yes. Not everybody gets that one.
That's a Van Halen one, and/or if you know why Van Halen called their album 5150, it is the police call for someone who is not mentally balanced.
That's right. I sent that to James Cridland. Sent it to him a few times. He didn't
get it.
Quite completely get it. Yeah. Hey, Dave, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. But just before you go, I just want you to list some of the podcasts where we can find you. I feel like I can find you on Saturday mornings. You're live on my phone and on the internet. You got the Podcast Rodeo Show. You're starting a new podcast about podcast websites. What else do you have?
Yeah, well, my flagship show is the School of Podcasting. But yeah, you mentioned Ask the Podcast Coach. And the problem is, and somebody asked me once, they're like, dude, you have way too many podcasts. Is there any like one place I can go to see them all? And so I bought the domain powerofpodcasting.com, which is the only time I will use a Linktree type website. That's the only time to use it. It's like, here's all my stuff. So you can see all my podcasts. I got my book over there. There's consulting. It's all there in one place, powerofpodcasting.com.
Dave, as always, thank you very much for doing this. Really, really appreciate
Matt,
it.
thank you so much, buddy. Appreciate it.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.